Hello everyone, today we talk about later medieval warfare with a focus on strategy. Telling the truth, this is part of a series that I conceived mostly for Renaissance, or at least say modern warfare. And so it serves the purpose of introducing the latter through the lens of late medieval warfare. You know that I made really, especially in the last year, but it was never really a rare topic on Schwerpunkt. Even in the past, lots of videos about especially 15th century warfare that at some point have began, aside from the more specific ones about single battles or, tactics or whatever, heavily revolve around this, say, historiographical effort in explaining an idea of change, right? A change that, especially on Schwerpunkt, as I also recently wrote about in the published work of the new military anthology, is not really emphasized by the channel. Rather, here we care about continuity and how essentially the same concept of modern warfare, in my personal opinion, as modern history in general, is a bit of a myth, right? To me, there are very important divides, sort of turning points ideally meant, but normally what was specifically spotted by at least the so-called the ideators of the so-called military or infantry in particular revolution are of course worth understanding, not with this terminology first and foremost, but as part of many different dynamics that actually were overlapping with one another, in that if especially studied from a strictly political institutional point of view, they exemplify a very solid continuum at really many levels, from the late medieval crisis, so essentially post-mid-14th century one, up until essentially either the French Revolution or World War I, depending on which countries in Europe you're looking at. There is naturally also something we'll have to extend on sort of non-European warfare that is, as far as I understand, academically understudied in this comparative fashion with saying Europe, or at least obviously most modern warfare and pike and shot sort of themed researches, etc., unavoidably start from Western focus. But very hardly so, just by method, in a truly comparative and diachronic way. You can't quite compare simply just two things right across the globe and pretending that this also and to do this without fitting them into a much broader horizon that you should be able to have studied. On Schwerpunkt, I'm giving you the idea of what this means. Of course, this is not, say, each video that I make is not really a fully researched paper, the way it would take really months to write at some point. Not actually, those at least are much longer than an average video script of mine. And in any case, that's not the point here. But obviously, in at least being able to explain what was happening in different times, in different places, and looking at the military essence of that, which, in my opinion, has become very, ever more distant, as much as we have taken not just war, which has its own historical problems of interpretation, mostly due to specifically bad scholarship, but basically any other theme more like as an excuse and a background rather than an object of studying in and of itself. And that's why I absolutely stress the difference between the art of war and military history. I say the history of the art of war, military history, because military history can be general polymology, can be anything, right? There are lots of military historians that literally have never posed themselves the question of how did actually armies work in the field, how they fight, whatever, just because they may be talking, as I often say, about military propaganda and not looking at what was actually happening. The art of war is not just diachronic and compare, but it's really about explaining, if anything, how war is waged, which is a political theme. So it is true that it is to be always framed within the subordinated instrumental relation of War II politics, but it has, in fact, to explain the military action through that specific purpose. And so by explaining how war was actually waged, you're not just describing some abstract picture, but rather something very concrete. Reason for which it is also difficult, and I like these challenges to a degree, to even approach a topic like late medieval strategy, right? Also because, as you know, the same concept of strategy was not properly around in that era. Just think that Latin did not have a term for strategy, and it's not like it prevented the Romans or the medievals in the West from fighting effectively. That also would require an important amount of description, because it's a topic that we never really, I mean, even though I explain it in the moment in which I explain the art of war, at many levels, I've never really made a specific video conceptualizing the thing. That is to say, what is strategy in a time and place where the concept of strategy has not been, at least developed along our own same patterns, has not been rationalized, written down, explored in or for a specific positive purpose of application. You have to really await von Clausewitz for that, and for him to tell you that essentially, at most, this is just some kind of theoretical information of a practice that you have to carry out by yourself. It is kind of obvious. But it's also fascinating in this sense to look at how strategy worked, at least strategy always exists, right? That's also why I have the Von Krieger playlist explaining also what most critiques of von Clausewitz would like to make you believe it. That is to say that von Clausewitz is just, punctiform character that tells you about Napoleonic warfare and did not understand medieval warfare or 21st century warfare. And if you think that about von Clausewitz, it's because you literally have never even read the premises to the work. You don't know what it is that he explains. And it's absolutely normal, because it's not like just ignorance is normal nowadays, but it's just literally the notion of not studying, not spending any time to work, right? And wanting to essentially proceed by a collection of hearsay quotes other than properly working on things and with your own sweat and tears can make you learn anything, right? It's like reading. You can read books for your entire life but remaining a complete moron, right? There is a difference between reading, learning, understanding, studying, and more, right? And so do not make the silly mistake of presuming that you can interpret reality just out of a whim. It takes really a long time just to understand in a concrete fashion very few set of things. That's why, by the way, I'm making all these videos on top of everything, because it's also about that, right? Not just repetita juvent, as the Latins used to say, but because this practice in and of itself helps you explaining reality for how history provides it to us, right? Remember that history, as von Clausewitz also explains, provides us with actual evidence of things that actually existed. All right, it's not like there isn't a problem of reconstruction. Von Clausewitz is the first person to say that at the end of a battle, even when we know the outcome, etc., it's practically impossible to determine how this battle was exactly fought in all its components. And I can absolutely relate, because those papers that I was telling you about before are really mostly revolving around battles, as I specialize in tactics. And given the information you may have from 14th century warfare, just today I didn't conceptualize it because I keep my work separated. Just today I was writing just about the position of an army, given the development of the battle from the sources of an engagement in the 14th century. In order to explain how the battle went, which is how my attitude is, like I write the article to tell you, look, this thing existed, it went like this is the best reconstruction we can have. That there's a very concrete objective effort in that, like in the sense, objectivizing effort, if you prefer, in explaining how reality actually took place. And military history has this inherent logic that you can extrapolate and that eventually substantiates in the art of war. And just today, it was to eventually discuss basically this 14th, 15th century warfare. The battle was 1341, by the way. And so there is a wide space also of probably a medium point between so-called modernists and medievalists regarding like the achievement of a better understanding of this phase that probably is being... Modernists often study also the later Middle Ages much more than the medievalists study the early modern, the 16th century, the beginning of the early modern age. And this is somehow odd because, again, modernists decided that at some point the premises for their revolution that did not exist were some kind of dramatic stepping up of late medieval statehood, military capacity, whereas actually in absolute terms, medieval armies of the 13th and 14th century were stronger than the later ones. If you look at the scale, the numbers, also made videos about this for that matter. And this is also explained by a matter of post-crisis context. So you can have firearms, but that even in and of itself, just considering firepower also in previous years, was not by far like the tipping the balance, especially when you look at the scale of those armies. So today we could talk about a lot of things, and let's try to at least glue them together in a way that makes sense. Because the ultimate question, at the end of the day, when we talk strategy here, is after assembling an army, which is also what in military theory you give for granted of working fully well, and at large, this is actually true if you study, especially the Middle Ages. How was it used, right? In my experience as a medievalist, and especially, again, having researched tactics, but having obviously studied campaigns for that reason, I've never really seen... I've seen, for example, in today's battle I was discussing, like I was writing about, I've seen sort of some better or worse choices to some degree, but never really seen a fundamental incompetence in warfare waging. And this is yet another thing that I suspect people today do not get right all the time. They have to essentially point out a specific flaw that would have undermined the whole thing since the beginning. Just think about the endless discussions on the Eastern Front or those kind of scenarios, without realizing that warfare is fought along the way, that you cannot actually predict how an army is going to fight, even when you radically underestimate an enemy, or when, again, things seem really different from what they would eventually turn out to be. This is the product of something that is largely unpredictable from both sides, right? Not just the one who screws up. So we have always this one-sided perspective. Especially YouTube channels have somehow fed, especially I don't hear it very much, like this, I'll tell you this sort of this war, this battle from the side's perspective. And, you know that von Clausewitz has the laws of reciprocity. That, of course, you must understand the various perspectives, but exactly as they are intertwined, and these forces are reciprocally influencing one another, especially in a moral fashion. Because, in fact, warfare is not just an act of force to compel your enemy to fulfill your will, but is also largely a struggle between moral forces rather than material ones. And so, when you look at the practice of warfare at the time, one thing that strikes you in general is how habitual for them it really was to go to war, right? All this moralizing whinery about warfare that you see nowadays, especially in a pacifistic direction, that is very often designed to undermine the effort of whichever side these people are whining from, is... of course, such a thing existed at the time. There was a lot of self-sabotage in all time in history, etc. And this is also what the enemy, again, played on, and reciprocally vice versa. But in terms of sheer military practice, everything was so normal in terms of technical fluidity, so to say, that it's as if nobody posed themselves. In fact, this is exactly how it happened. The question of, for example, writing down how war was actually waged. We mostly have an idea that there is a celebration of warfare at some point. There's a moral approach to that. There is even praise in it. What you hear about warfare is mostly positive throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages. I mean, war is terrible, and everybody points that out. It's all very impressive, etc. But there is not a bottom line that says, well, okay, so we should stop making war. Nobody reasoned apparently like that, or at least there are people, of course, that reason like that. There were pacifists at the time. We have seen it also in the video about the Cathars as a broader intention, right? Which is a heresy at the end of the day. It's not a political siding. It's just literally the product of a worldview that is fundamentally a dualistic alienation from the same reality, very much fed by materialism and anti-materialism, but still by essentially taking materialism as concrete. In that case, in particular, the greatest winery about warfare is mostly something that starts spreading from the moment of the crumbling of the great tradition, universal tradition, the universal powers. In fact, at the end of the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, right? In the Renaissance, there were objectively terrible wars that made the Renaissance actually an incredibly terrible time to live, and absolutely not improving the condition, for example, the relative liberty of individuals. There's absolutely nothing to do with that. If anyone has an idea of history of institution of society, I don't know, the peasants was much freer in the Middle Ages, and I mean even at the peak of the great medieval civilization, not in the during the migration era that frankly sucked, and people really had it worse than when there were more powerful lords. But exactly in this sense, let's say maybe people's lives later was actually better, but the terms of sort of breaking free in a more individualistic or autonomous fashion was not really true. It was mostly pioneered by nations that were opportunistically exploiting confessional struggles and collapse of moral standards to achieve something in the moment from a provincial perspective. But at the end of the day, and there is all that rhetoric that is sort of inflating this. But why should we pay for war? Well, because maybe you're going to lose a lot. My experience, especially in every theater, also. But I mean, I've researched myself about this. Is all the peoples that whine the most about war were the first one to be taken over by somebody else, right? To lose their liberty, and this is so obvious, right? Well, the most powerful countries were the ones who celebrated lording over others, except also in the measure in which they succeeded, because others did too at some point, but were always inferiorly passive-aggressive and trying always to undermine the bigger civilization. At the end of the day, in fact, in West kept developing further, even in spite of all this winery, because this winery can be in parallel to lots of things that are also developing. There is no doubt that in the Renaissance, there are some things that are done right, even within this pretty perturbed contexts, so to say. So when we have to answer this question, how were armies utilized? Well, when you look at this period, 14th, 15th century, much like in any other era, and in a civilized context, the primary goal of warfare was territorial acquisition. It may seem a cliche, especially if you indeed make it a simply territorialistic fashion. It's not like people looked at a map, they said, okay, I want just to take that piece of... No, right? There was a power struggle, essentially, between everybody involved, and the most effective way to gain power, more resources, mostly the people who lived in that land, rather than land in itself, was to conquer it. All right. And naturally, this was facilitated by the general political fragmentation, and still at this point, you could argue plagued Europe, even though this was, in fact, prompting a recompositive process through wars of conquest. And actually administrative unification, etc. There's plenty of this. Think about, I don't know, the Burgundian states, right? Made lots of videos on those, and I don't know, Flanders that had emerged, let's say, as autonomous communities in a very parcel political fashion, and unavoidably being always under somebody else's control in a way or another, were recompacted under, in fact, the guidance of the Valois-Burgundy, French rule that somehow conferred a proto-national identity to eventually like the Flemish nation in some broader administrative sense, rather than just like a matter of language or some looser identification of different communities that, by the way, hated each other and fought each other, in fact, on a regular basis. Again, we have seen this very well in our series about regional history, how essentially different polities either fail or go forward in this process. And so if in the first case they basically are absorbed by other people, they lose their own autonomy, and they just participate as subjects that at some point also recompact under their kind of higher rule, or in fact they go forward and they, generally speaking, are the most successful, more civilized, more effective powers. Today we don't venture into the Renaissance, but obviously, as I was saying before, there is a bridge here that we have to gap. So in a sense, it's useful in this video to look mostly at the later history rather than the previous one. Also because, again, the Black Death crisis and trauma had been pretty strong. It had, in fact, informed a society that, I don't know, in the 15th century was much more similar to the one of the 17th century than, I don't know, the one of the 13th, right? Excuse me, drink a little. So, the reason behind conflict obviously can be infinite, right? You can't even separate between an authentic motivation or some excuse. Everything was used always. Propaganda existed at the time. Fake news existed at the time. Any kind of political infiltration existed at the time. Any kind of self-sabotage from, opposing internal factions existed at the time. Nothing ever changed. Right. It's also debunked the ridiculous notion of the post-Westphalian war. Like, again, the post Black Death war is a much more concrete reality than, I don't know, looking at even the outcome of the 30 Years' War. Doesn't matter how important it really was. There isn't really ever in history a state that is solely unitary, ethno-linguistically homogeneous, that is fighting only under a single banner, without dissidence, without internal sabotage, resistance whatsoever. Everything is always blurred, overlapping, dirty, chaotic. And that's exactly where you can distinguish better who eventually emerges triumphant and is able to conquer sort of more of the opinion, the decisive moral majority of the people. And don't confuse the decisive majority of the people in, I don't know, there is more concentrated power, say, in a totalitarian regime as if, that people were stronger than by wanting a more centralized power. That's not how it works. In some cases it is true, but only if that power is an actual power. The decisive majority, moral majority of people can be also an incredibly low quantity of the decisive majority of the people. It's just in relative terms to that people, right? You can be a people that is that has the same sort of political alignment, but has a much superior morality and power. So to, in fact, have that power achieve much more, that also the much more politically compact, apparently compact countries. Now, in more modern times, there is also this idea that, by the way, warfare would have allegedly changed. It's a bit what we were saying before in the critique towards von Clausewitz, that does not understand anything nor about von Clausewitz nor about the world, that reasons would be more essentially either nationalistic or ethnic, or driven by overtly economic or some more abstract concepts of power, ambitions. People say, oh, look, colonialism was a different type of, politics, conflicts, and warfare than, I don't know, these wars. Doesn't make any sense. Like, obviously, everything is always declined to the subject matter, but the bottom reasons why you want or to struggle or in control are much more physically and metaphysically straightforward and very well described by tradition. The reason why we need to separate nationalism ethnicity, economy, to single them out as if, I don't know, they're just this guy who's seeking for power, as if other powers did not seek for power. Or, again, they weren't already, in a sense, more successful exactly because they don't have to look hysterically trying to get something without being able to do so, is a modernistic and contemporaneistic distortion and alienation from reality. This is such a separation of conflict and war that, remember, are two radically different things. Like, conflicts are what trigger a violent engagement at some point. And even about violence, we could discuss at length what it actually means, all right? But in practice, again, all these kind of motives were somehow there. I'm preparing a video that explains how, essentially, by moving away from tradition, the motivations for war did really change, but not, again, in typology. Rather in intensity, in quality, right? In kind of even by measure through outcome, for example, as well. In the age, for example, of the 19th century, of nationalism and or socialism. But you cannot say in the sense that in the Middle Ages there isn't, I don't know, a sense of nationhood, how we could morally conceive it, or some ethnic tension in this sense, or that warfare did not entail economic. Obviously, these are baked into the whole thing. Now, you can't. And you can actually find, also in the Middle Ages, some warfare is much more directly, say, on the surface, triggered by, I don't know, the control of some resource, right? Controlling salt mines. There were veritable wars that were triggered by this. Think about, we talked about recently the third war between Genoa and Venice in the 14th century, that again fall in nicely today's timeline. And again, you will find, in fact, in my playlist about the 14th, 15th century, lots of videos about different battles, campaigns, that illustrate how everything has to do with some kind of greater control-seeking and general purpose of recompacting order under some higher principle and by universal standard. This is what effectively motivates warfare, except you can't fall short of the higher principles, and so making wars that at the end of the day not just you will lose, but that will have cost too much or will have not really improved the situation, will have lost that capacity of redeeming those who participate into creating, even through bloodshed, something greater, which is what tradition was basically substantiating. You understand that in the moment in which you deny tradition, universalism, unity, you're already astray from those concepts. Like people who are afraid of a single rule are so because they literally in their own world, they're which is so inferior, they cannot understand any power without some kind of shortcoming, right? And without understanding that the only unitary power that can exist is forcefully the highest. Otherwise, it would never would never work. But let's not digress in theology, because that's another matter. Just, however, realize that in the later Middle Ages, they absolutely believed this as well. During the period in question, you can find all sort of the human flows that you can understand, like political opportunism, a general quest for dominance without some broader horizons, some general idea that, after all, that was a duty and that the rulers still were to be about warfare. So very much this fits with the actually widespread level of military reasons that, when you especially examine in the moment, appear to be particularly concrete and solid, right, compared to some kind of mindless form of chaos or anarchy, as sometimes the Middle Ages are depicted. I didn't because I hated the thing, but I saw, like, at some point some seminaries were talking in that sense about the 10th century, just presuming that there was chaos in Europe at some point just because there was some more fragmented political and therefore military picture after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, not realizing, if you actually study, in fact, the military logic In fact, the political goals of the lords involved in that so-called Iron Century, that not just these were very solid motivations, but that also essentially seeded the enormous potential for medieval civilization to boom, to blossom, also through military expansion, but backed by an incredible political and social power that reflects a higher culture and some incredible power that for some reason in the West, especially lesser people, try always to underestimate. We find this still in the 15th century. We've seen many contexts. Right before we mentioned the Italy of the signories. And so when you look at city-states like Milan and Florence, we made multiple videos. There is the Battle of Molinella in particular. You realize that that kind of power struggle was fundamentally over the largest resources available in the peninsula. These are clashes in which Venice is prevented at some point from taking over immense amounts of land all over central and northern Italy. The struggles in particular we cited now between Milan and Florence. We just made a video explaining how Florence shifted under Cosimo de' Medici towards the Sforza of Milan. Had tried to do the same in the previous generations without result. And so at that point, making the Italians at large realize that they had at least to work out some kind of repartition of spheres of influence, and if anything, staying, especially after the mid-15th century, the end of the 100 Years' War with France free, the fall of Constantinople with the Turks at the gates, to recompact in a broader sort of national sense to prevent foreigners from stamping in their own land, which eventually failed, but also because, again, if you look at those signories in their merit, they sort of miscalculated things, but also at some point calculated them to the extent of saying, as long as I get more power and my neighbor is taken out, it's kind of okay. It depends at that point, you understand, on the scale of this game, right? Because this, by Western standards, is deleterious. But let's say if you look at Central Europe, you realize that powers were much smaller, and there were still some kind of feudal seigneury at a local rather than even provincial level that could not even extend more than much, a few tens of kilometers away. So this is interesting because you can feel the pulse of power through studying, as I was saying before, different powers in comparison. In the same context, when I made a video about the condottieri that made really lots of views for some reason, and who they were. These were essentially professional captains for hire, whose loyalty was secured through contracts. The most famous book on them, at least in the Anglosphere, is, of course, Mallet's Mercenaries and Their Masters. But it's not just about the fact that it's from 1974, but Mallet passed away, and much more was written on this, but not too much, actually, for how much it could have been written on a topic like this. But you realize, for example, Mallet, when people ask me for a bibliography, I'm habituated coming from academia where you write a note for everything, right? And admittedly, some publishing houses that want to sell also to the broader public say, notes, what are they? But even these great academic names at time, you read Mercenaries and Their Masters, and there's actually there are notes, but every once in a while, like it's that thing of more or less I took some sensible information of what I just said from there, and you go there, and by the way, you go at the same pages that they pointed out, and you realize that those pages do not even say exactly what they actually cited, and so it's complicated to even understand where they got the information from. So these are names celebrated by scholarship, but people come ask me to make to cite everything I say while making YouTube videos. I mean, it seems rather ridiculous, especially if you have not understood yet that I am obviously making a lot of original content, and what I learned over the years, and even mostly from my academic background but through the channel, is in and of itself, as a broader critique, worth spending. Besides, we often talk about sources, authors, like in this case, very cursorily now, but we make entire videos about entire sources. Read Pharsalus, just for referring to a recent video about especially battles. That's where I show you also not how I really work, because again, it's not how I would write an article on the topic, but how more or less like history, also especially for ancient history in that case, gets down to. Already at this point, like studying 14th, 15th century history is very complicated. There is really a lot of sources that interplay with one another. Some are also just preserved in archives. You have to literally go pick and read them. I prefer times for which, there is still this, but at least somebody else published most of the wall. All the sources are more readily accessible. So for free online, of course, I had to photograph, if anything, or buy lots of books for that matter. In my work, unfortunately, I have the secretaries at the department that provide me with articles, especially sections of books, whatever I need in the moment, not too big, mostly 40 pages at a time, but let's say, you must make that research. You may never also know whether what you're searching is better or worse. Say, mostly people research scholarship, but if you really want to understand, again, things like warfare in their mechanisms, you have to study not just one source. People think that as historians, look, we pick one source we found in an archive, and you have to make an astonishing research just to find a source like that is just literally maybe the description of a siege. There's just literally a description of a siege. I mean, it doesn't add too much to all the sieges we already know about. In this sense, what you should have done by yourself is, picking all the chronicles from that era, from that topic, from that event. There are maybe 20, right? And reading them all, contextualizing them, being careful about the original language, where they say the battle took place, taking a map, trying to reconstruct there, looking at the numbers, how were these troops deployed. That's how you study warfare, right? And it takes forever. So it's not a mere chit-chat, right? Regarding motives, again, there is really plenty of these. Dynastic struggles are the same ones that trigger, for example, the 100 Years' War. That is arguably the most famous war or set of wars that well exemplifies, especially this sort of a clash between two major fully fledged Western European monarchies that are also very similar to some extent. And that, again, is so iconic, right? The Reds and the Blues are some kind of that. That's how Edward III of England laid claim to the French throne in 1337. It's not like issues between France and England had started then or would end after the war, as we all know. As also a great part of Schwerpunkt's content is dedicated to, and so thankfully in historical perspective. But jokes aside, like you understand the broader implications of this. And you see that's the limit of categorism. What was the so-called 100 Years' War about? Right. Overall, it lasted more than 100 years even. But again, there were different wars that did not last, in fact, 100 years. But again, was this conflict merely about feudal inheritance disputes? Right, or can we even just think that the broader goal, think about the role of Flanders, was essentially like fueling the war by simple economic ambitions that surely were there, but were they sort of major for us to simply say, okay, well, it's kind of right, because that's the rhetoric, the anti-traditional rhetoric. I was this kind of thing that they couldn't sort out for sure, etc., but they actually wanted the money, man. No, there is much more to that, right? There are some much bigger political issues at hand. There is the hegemony over, again, Northwestern Europe, a broader, in this sense, historical stand, the fact that the same English dynasty, we were essentially Anglo. They were actually descending from the Normans altogether since 1066, and they, there was something so atavic about the contrast, the feudal entanglement, and the rivalry between France and England that cannot be simply reduced again to money. It was actual territorial control. Through dynastic struggle, it was incredibly common, and if anything, giving much of the legitimacy to the war itself. And this is also very important to traditionally understand the role of genetics, the role of I exist, and this has a metaphysical implication given my level of power that reflects divine favor. And so the way I act is potentially yielding potentially infinite fruits if I'm actually virtuous. And there is something, again, that, as I said before, gets down to the entire purpose of the war to be reunited against a single power. And so, again, to lower it to some materialistic or relativistic reason doesn't sound pretty interesting. Naturally, yes, resources, struggling for control of resources is always a thing, but it's what you can build over those resources, what already exists, that matters. We made multiple videos about, for example, how the same war from the French side steered a dramatic upgrading and innovation in statal development, in tax collection, in military reform. Again, and I really want to talk as much as possible. We have really a lot about high medieval warfare, or also about the 13th century as well, part of the early 14th, but I really want to expand more on later medieval warfare, because it seems to me that it became too much of a meme. And that on Schwerpunkt we make really a lot of medieval warfare stuff, and in a great depth. So from my side, looking at all the playlists, I can see where the gaps are, how we can fill this vacuum. But let's say at large, there is really a lot you can ponder on, especially if you're a new subscriber. And we're never going to stop in this sense, because this is too big. The Middle Ages are too complex to simply be browsed in simplistic terms, as any other part of history telling the truth. There is still a poor economy. Again, we're talking pre-industrial societies, especially after the crisis of the mid-14th century, that, is also partly what enables at least the English successes of, especially early in the war, the collapse of this Leviathan of France, especially in the provinces that were eventually ravaged, as we will see now, better by the English, and the Anglo-Gascon chevauchée. Again, the French in the north have to sacrifice even some parts of this potentially imperial domination across this enormous and enormously fertile and populated agriculturally productive Atlantic plains that is lost, right? And we tend also to think, okay, well, there had been the plague, mostly of the damage was essentially demographic, right? It's not really correct. It was mostly a political issue. I mean, all the ideological regurgitation of the lower estates, all the sort of perceived oppression from the side of the feudal aristocracy that blipped up at Crusades, at Poitiers. Also made a video about that battle. It was one of the most beautiful battles I've ever studied, telling the truth. Masterpiece of the Black Prince. It's very, very tactically complete. Is always at the root of, okay, so now what do we do? Like, do we side with the enemy? Or actually the English contributed to alienate further much of these lands that historically, as you know, during the so-called Angevin Empire, maybe a debatable term, but had somehow brought to certain parts of France to lean towards, in fact, the same English crown in a decentralized fashion. There is all a history to that, a history of French. Most of this continues still, I don't know, during the French Confessional Wars, the French Revolution. The English always infested areas like, Brittany, Gascony, and the south, against the core of the north that mostly held true to in terms of loyalty and to kings, even though things went at some point were pretty messed up with this major revolution. So there is the Jacquerie. Made multiple videos about French nobiliary revolts. The dialectic between the monarchy and the nobility is always very complicated. This is true for the English. by the way. We often forget that we talk often about the marvelous English army of the 100 Years' War. Marvelous because it was actually pretty much like any other Western European army, except, again, higher in moral quality, and so striking those exceptional blows to a French monarchy in this sense was quite weakened, even though it survived and won the war ultimately. But if the English had lost even one of the major battles of the 100 Years' War, for which they were rightly famous, that also England would have witnessed probably some kind of revolution. It's not like even there weren't attempts or at least some movements that would ominously sort of loom over, say, also a monarchy that had, as you know, historically to cope with baronial limits, since yet, in fact, another big defeat, that is the one of Bouvines, made lots of videos about late medieval constitutions, governmental systems, etc. So we're gradually getting to the further depths of this all. Naturally, in all of this, traditional belief was still largely intact, especially considering that the establishment that was in charge was paradoxically even more in charge, because in spite of all these uprisings, actually one common element that they all had is they were all put down. Right? There isn't any successful revolt in the later Middle Ages. The peasants, the commoners, go irremediably down, and they remain there for centuries and centuries, again, in a way that they would have not imagined even in the previous centuries in the Middle Ages. And so this kind of also often rebellistic sympathies of lesser people today, and they think at some point in the Middle Ages there were the cocky peasants that dictated law to the aristocrats. I don't think that you really understand what it means to be a peasant, what it means to be an aristocrat in those times. And this man-at-arms, the whole, just yesterday I made a video about the feudal system that actually I was criticizing kings and generals for that at least they said in later Middle Ages feudalism was an actual thing, and or at least it aligns more with the concept, the historiographical concept that we have. You can check that video out if you haven't still. They incarnated an incredible level of psychophysical quality, superiority, and valor, right? There was a lot of religious zeal that naturally was widespread among the people. Again, the rebels we just described were often driven by heretical ideologies against, in fact, constituted order, very much like fringe, like foretestators behave like today. And it's not like it didn't work in tandem, like the aristocratic world was separated from these movements, or at least when the aristocrats ruled, there wasn't need for the lower elements at all. We know very well how everything went integrated. And there were, by the way, still at this point in history, fully fledged crusades. Right, Crusades do not end with the fall of Acre in 1291. I made a video about the entire siege. They go on, and also without too much problem. Yes, there is some kind of, we lost the Holy Land. That's a big deal. There is, again, together, especially with the crisis of the later medieval war, that affects also the Muslims and the entire civilization across the world. There is, for now, we will not come back there. Right. Then eventually, with the modern and contemporary times, it would happen once again, just like the Romans had done, the Macedonians had done back in the day. Even the Sea Peoples with less lasting results. Even though if you look at the Hittites, if you look at, again, let's not now just talk about the Europeans, but still, right? You don't find this done by the Muslims. If not when they settled in Europe by themselves, meaning the Turks, the Ottoman Turks were basically Europeans in their rise. They had emerged from the Marmara Sea, and mostly they, also against the other Muslims, constitute a European power of some sort. Nevertheless, there are recurrent crusades against the aforementioned Turks, exemplified by the failed one, for example, of Nicopolis in 1396, then there is Varna in 1444, but I don't know, in the 40s and the 50s, there was the famous crusade against Smyrna, there was a lot of sort of mainstream idea, again, going to fight against the infidels was absolutely the norm, and there was always an excuse for doing so. The Reconquista was technically over because after Las Navas, every Muslim power in Spain was technically was sort of the vassalage of some Christian monarchy. Campaigns targeting the Baltic and Slavic peoples were still there, by the way. It was a broader sense of divide, even with sort of the world that had been evangelized by the Byzantines. I mean, if you were Orthodox, you were not that different from a Muslim or a Jew or a pre-Christian for that matter. As you know, the Lithuanians are the last people to convert to Christianity in the latter half of the 14th century in Europe. And they were even just like an actual power by that point. That's also why they fully Christianized. They had just withheld that for a while, because since previous centuries, of course, they had relations with the Pope and asking to sort of brokering this kind of potential evangelization, mostly to escape the pressure of the Teutonic Order. But again, those in fact also national rivalries. Think about the Poles that technically had installed the Teutonic Knights to fight against the Prussians, and then this thing takes over. Like it could happen in Hungary. I mean, it actually started in Hungary, but the Hungarian kings got rid of the Teutonic Knights quite quickly, not to have this thing spread. At the end of the day, the Teutonic Knights from vassals of the Polish kings turned into some kind of more threatening power to them, and the Poles and the Lithuanians have to ally to defeat in 1410 at Tannenberg, Grunwald, whatever you want to call it, the Teutonic army, and there is a lot beyond like these stories. Also in the early modern ages, I'm preparing a video about the military orders in the early modern age, for that matter. A little mention to the Teutonic Knights. It's mostly about the Hospitallers, the Knights of Malta. But just for saying how actually, again, normal and the traditional mindset was also across the Middle Ages and the modern age, with the latter period having the same exact dynamics. Again, I thoroughly described this in my modern warfare videos that mostly have this light motive, right? Aside from the single most sort of secularized, modernized powers in Western Europe, you have at large, like most of the continent, if not those countries too, regardless of things like, the Reformation, etc., that continue along this traditional ideas and beliefs of knighthood. I just made a video about the First Moravian War, where you see how there were some Protestant Saxon soldiers that had no problem in serving in the Christian coalition force of purely Catholic powers, starting from the papacy, but mostly also Venice, Tuscany, to fight against the Ottoman Turks. While, of course, like during the seizure of Vienna, many Protestants, but even many Catholics that were jealous of Habsburgic powers, such as Louis XIV, tried to sabotage the cause in favor of the Turks, basically, so against other Christians. So it's complicated. You understand how pernicious heresies also were. Think about the Hussite movement. We made multiple videos on that as well. At some point, you had an heretic king in the 15th century that was also trying to distract by saying, well, why do we fight against one another? Well, there are the Ottomans swarming in the Balkans. Well, because, if Bohemia was a freaking Catholic country aligned with the whole Central Europe against the Fourth, maybe it would be in a better situation. And there is indeed in the later Middle Ages, especially after the fall of Constantinople, this sense of defeatism, of fear, the great fear of the Turk. That's a title I used at some point in some of my videos that continues further in history. So again, everything finds its place in this picture. When you look at these ideologies, you understand also how, of course, there was much practicality behind them. When you think about the expansion of the Teutonic Order or, Swedish power, everything was very much controlled by monarchies that had particular regional ambitions, that they had spheres of influence, very often, very scarce, meager resources that they had to invest in the moment before the next civil war broke out, a dynastic struggle within the kingdom. And so everything is blended in, of course, as far as motivation is concerned. Again, securing, even in the moment, even not for the longest term, because you simply cannot calculate that. That is also essential in order to understand strategy, basically in every time, because today we think that the world is more stable. That's, in a sense, it is true, but we understand it mostly in a sense of political territorial fashion. But it's not really more stable in terms of the currents that agitate within it. At some point, bring about great changes as well, also of the sudden. But in a world like, again, the Middle Ages, where public authority has a ridiculous coercive power compared to our state, you really have a degree of, you're always a step away from collapse, in a sense. What is striking in this regard is how still, however, states evolved gradually, countries took shape regardless of this instability. So there was something solid, sound at the basis, as we talked about before, about France, for example, during the 100 Years' War, that evidently managed to win over that decisive moral majority, which are people they came to eventually rule on. But what can favor you in the moment, just to gain that much, for you to have enough breath to survive yet another day, is crucial. And so many of the decisions that you see there must be calculated in this constant dice rolling to which rulers had always been habituated. Right, and this also falls in all metaphysical perspective on the nature of power and how you actually control it. That you never stop fighting, fundamentally. I discussed this in the video about the meaning of sacred royalty in the universal tradition. Right, fighting against yet not Christianized populations is a form of bringing order. Right, of bringing gods low to also elevate these peoples and to mold them into something more civilized, which is technically what actually happened. Right, this is not true just for colonialism. Given that the world today is basically European, there isn't much way around that. As from within the same Europe, right, the conquest of the Baltic, in many ways was. During some of the bloodiest pages in the European Middle Ages, actually bringing a process of civilization. Again, the Baltic peoples were not as advanced as the Germans, or they were not even as advanced as the Scandinavians, for that matter, that also had taken a long time before having anything stable in terms of a monarchy, of a state of some sort, and that improved at that point. Right? I think it's undeniable. So in each of these scenarios, the aggressor's primary aim, militarily speaking, was almost invariably to seize further territory, a goal that shaped both strategy and outcomes, obviously enough. Considering especially the level of encapsulation of medieval Europe, the most obvious practice of any army was advancing somewhere, seizing control of different castles along the way, and then maybe besieging a bigger settlement, so to draw an enemy force near, to engage in a big battle, and on the basis of that outcome, you could take over more castles in the moment. Right? Otherwise, you could withdraw to part of those who had conquered if they hadn't risen up against you. Because the later Middle Ages is also a phase where things were a bit simplifying compared to the previous centuries. Maybe again in Northeastern Europe, things seemed more medieval. Right? Where literally, again, power was very scarce. But let's say if you take Western European standards, you realize that, taking over multiple cities at a time, brokering, land exchanges, it was already much more advancedly managed, all right? Armies were bigger, they were more efficient, everything was more compacted, more civilized at different levels. This doesn't mean that war wasn't terrifying in a way, but in a sense it was less warred, right, and forever dragging as some kind of typical raiding warfare you can imagine in the High Middle Ages. And even that had a purpose at the time that was the same purpose achieved in the measure now warfare was a more civilized business, because simply you would control more, and so you would at least tend to smoothen the edges, unless, of course, there was a frontal clash that could always happen. But also that was meant to turn sort of a more meaningful page in that level of power settling, right? So, and stabilization and ultimate pacification at the end of the day. The aggressor is always the one that, let's say, it's not that ideologically wants peace because we have overloaded peace with sort of strange ideological meanings, but meaning peace in the sense the end of the war, right? He who engages in the offensive, we've seen it from Clausewitz, is the one that ideally, given that he's also paying more for it, wants to have it settled more quickly and for good. The defender has more time. The defender has greater interest in sort of from that advantageous position to exploit that harder form of war. Of course, again, the aforementioned fragmentation tendentially helped complicating the picture, and or at least having lots of back and forth offensives, counteroffensives, like different political allegiance. So again, everything is mostly politically understandable. And then military would be declined along interesting patterns. Again, understanding how professional troops worked as opposed to, feudal retinues or communal militias, in realizing that they fought all in the same armies altogether is in and of itself the broader alchemy necessary to understand the whole picture. There is a real strategy. As I was saying before, you can't say that since this was some kind of smaller type of warfare, or however you want to define it, that this does not fit a Clausewitzian understanding. The Prussian general, by the way, was incredibly aware, as a very thorough military historian, of all this sort of lordly quarrels and how warfare was declining in that era. In fact, he discusses that. There is a specific reference at different times of the Von Krieg to those sort of less developed people saying, in the past, if we're talking tribes there, von Clausewitz does describe them mostly making the extreme of the savage of the 18th, the 19th century in other parts of the world, etc., but not because he is characterizing that in a culturalistic sense, as somebody would like to believe, but because he's reasoning by a spectrum of extremes, right? So obviously Europeans were at the forefront, and he derives from their warfare the theoretical model through the examples that this would offer. But equally, he is very aware of that older and more primitive type of warfare and how it concretely worked. And he beautifully exemplifies that. So again, any person who thinks that von Clausewitz was just describing the Napoleonic era should really seriously study the Von Krieg itself. You can see warfare naturally in many ways. Like, for the sake of discussion, you can look at some even instinctual joy in sort of shattering the enemy in strength, primarily through annihilating their forces in open combat. This is interesting because there is actually within the Clausewitzian trinity the element of blind hatred belonging to the people that is primordial and instinctive, in order especially to offend. Von Clausewitz says all three the elements of the Trinity, that is namely the politics that actually incarnates reason, and the military that actually incarnates gamble, right? Never make that silly, again, populistic notion that since you're a soldier you understand politics better than No, that's not how it works. And again, you, especially at this time in history, you realize that commanders were also politicians in many ways, and so it's very interesting also to look at more concretely, just as much as realizing how much more devastatingly powerful we are today, where things are relatively more separated. And it is true, as also von Clausewitz agrees, that even though the purpose of war is, as we've seen, mostly motivational, right? You have to break the enemy will to fight on and to accept essentially what you're demanding of him. This does factually pass through, it can pass through different things at a time, But he says it concretely gets down to, given that warfare is asymmetrical but tendentially balanced, so tending towards symmetry, especially the bigger the scale of it is, it does translate into a veritable massacre of large amounts of people, all right, in terms of especially the armed forces that are the actual military, let's say, mean through which you can operate. So from the other side. And again, so let's not confuse in this sense, for example, the armed forces per se being the annihilation of the armed forces being the mere objective of this in a physical sense. So you can, in theory, and hopefully cut off the war short by even killing less, like fighting less. But this tends, for the reasons that we just explained, not to be quite the case. So we'll come back on von Clausewitz at some point highlighting different aspects, even in his own ideology, that is incredibly, again, objective, morally and scientifically sound, that are objectively not easy to understand, right? But that really must, if you want to discuss him in the first place. In this time, besides the deliberate aim, or at least the actual capacity of obliterating the enemy's army per se, was seldom pursued. There are many reasons for this. In part, the aforementioned political intertwinement, the fact that, again, you can't simply, again, if you can't shut yourself down, if you fight, this happens often. You don't take it as a general rule, but there are battles that are fought until dawn. Why? Because it was an accident, by chance they stopped at dawn. No, because at dawn you can't go on fighting in an articulated fashion, and you can, if anything, flee if you are having the worst of that, so that we will actually have lost the battle, but you can take refuge in the many castles around, and if the enemy wants to take them over, it will take some time, and at least lots of people will be able to escape in that way. Also, of course, and it's not like warfare is actually less bloody in relative terms, all right? It's just that the political means to achieve some more crushing victory are more limited, and so this, from a military point of view, is also translated, especially at the strategic level. At the tactical level, this is not really true. Like, you can't say, in the moment in which an army melts away, it starts surrounding, there isn't a time in history in which you can say it's more or less bloody, right? The pursuit kills people. That's the moment in which the greatest bloodshed is carried out. And medieval battles were incredibly bloody. I don't know who still goes on saying on bigger channels that medieval battles were not bloody, that before firearms things were less deadly. Like, if so, you literally have no idea of how, not just a medieval battle, but how a battle conceptually and practically and strategically is properly fought. And so, aside from this, I will not digress on it, but if anything, the means to structure an army are more local. Armies are tendentially smaller, as we've seen in this period. They're actually even smaller than in the previous centuries, because the 13th and 14th are really the peak. And this other battle, there is a refeudalization of warfare, especially commoners tend to disappear. They reappear only in the second half of the 15th century, when princes begin to hire this sort of essentially proletarians with their own money and arms. And so, not like, I don't know, in the previous centuries, the commoners armed themselves by themselves, and they integrated in the system of power also because of this, in the broader hierarchical system. So, this is in part also maybe a perspective distortion, because armies were small, relatively untrained, which is also really not, I mean, if medieval armies weren't trained, in which sense? That they were not a fully professional force, because there was a major state that can sort of put that. You really have to wait for mass society to have something of that kind. It's not even, I mean, there are different degrees of training, and it depends on what you're looking at. It's not like ancient armies were more trained than these ones, right? We have really a lot of misconceptions regarding that, if anything. If anything, at some point we will have to discuss them. It's true that given the higher political fragmentation, the state was less efficient, and so the same armed forces were mostly the product of coalition troops, right? This is an aspect that also within the bigger national monarchies of the time is often underestimated, how much politically sort of collectaneous, so to say, the participation to warfare normally was. There were infinite discussions in councils about the cost, about who put the money, we had to mobilize what, etc. So especially funding was pretty scarce normally. We've seen also how this is typical of the early modern age in many ways, so nothing really or as specifically precise. There are many different theaters. For example, some months ago I made a series about the free companies that ravaged a great deal of Europe, especially France and Italy, but let's say there were other countries that were also pretty tumultuous by themselves. And again, the mid-14th century crisis does not spare really anyone in that regard. Everything is thrown into some rapid turmoil. And actually, when you see paradoxically more free mercenary activity, it's also because there is actually a bigger system that normally comes back on its feet, and or that is actually wielding that. Like France will actually reunite under single power the Italian city-states, basically through mercenaries at one another, and none of these basically take over like a fief or whatever. And at some point, there are some German mercenaries that take over Denmark, literally, like they began to rule it next to the king. And so, or in spite of the king, so to say. This is especially evident when you look at the central and eastern part of Europe. You realize that there, it's as if, like, I don't know, the feudal era dragged on for forever, right? So by the 17th century, the 18th century, we have something dramatically similar to, in fact, what was late medieval warfare. We see, I don't know, that there is a guy who was called William Cafero, who made lots of articles on mercenary companies, especially in Italy, and he talked about Siena. I made multiple videos about medieval Siena, and there you can see how, for example, a rich republic of bankers could put together lots of money for some. There is the famous painting by Simone Martini of Guido Riccio from Fogliano, that was an Emilian mercenary from the Apennines, tough feudal breeds of the ancient noble lineages that served, in fact, quite brutal military competence to these republics. And there is the famous war with Crusades again, with peace, etc. And you see there an incredibly good sort of model management, right? But it was also very, and there were houses, nobiliary houses of Siena participating in all this, etc. So there was a mix between that feudal world and something already more tendentially organized, right? Banking is crucial to understand how advanced a civilization really is, regardless of, again, how lesser people basically, become phobic at the mere idea of. So there were different goals, as we've seen, especially territorial in nature, gaining time, creating buffer areas to prevent the enemy from targeting you. This is true at a local as a broader regional level. There are literally entire regions of Europe that were historically destructured because of the existence of a frontier. Think about central Spain, right? And the fact that agriculture was basically obliterated by that, and that as a consequence, it was an enormous amount of ship breeding that came with the Mesa to be the largest in Europe. That's a byproduct of several hundred years of frontier warfare. It was not the only place for that matter. There are many goals that you want to achieve. You may, as we've seen, undermine the enemy resources. You target the harvest. That was sort of the most obvious seasonal practice, especially in slightly more primitive times. There are the chevauchés in France that, as we've seen during the 100 Years' War, are led by the Anglo-Gascon as again, this system is collapsing. Is there any more sophisticated strategy to it? No, but let's go deep far. I mean, these were actually quite strategically complex operations, telling the truth. Also, at a logistical level, they were quite risky. Some of the biggest battles, as we've seen with Poitiers, also Azincourt, later stemmed from essentially from chevauchée, right? So the broader modus operandi revolved around this. It was quite risky and quite big, but at large, the good old raiding warfare, in a sense, was always there, and this was also pretty dramatic. There was almost, with the free companies, especially in France, some kind of parasitic installation in some castles and surrounding overlooking a countryside that they methodically looted in many ways. Naturally, these were mostly smaller bands that didn't have higher political strategical goals, and that's why they also sort of went nowhere at the end of the day. But there is really some massive damage carried out by the Anglo-Gascon chevauchée to the French agricultural infrastructure. Rogers wrote this in War Cruel and Sharp, for example, how that some of the material resources of the Valois monarchy were destroyed in the process with all the political, moral, and cultural consequences of the same. And this actually did contribute also to alienate great part of the population from both sides at some point, even though it was at some point easy for the French monarchy to reassert some kind of even heavier control in the local communities in exchange for protection by billeting. That's what the famous Compagnie d'Ordonnance were actually about. These were companies that, rather than remaining without a pay and going out there looting, the French kings paid with some kind of half salary, and they said, okay, install yourself for the rest in this town and protect it. All right. And that would work. The town would partially billet, sustain these guys, maintain the cost of this, but still they would be protected. So you understand how, and this was gradually witnessing to the building up of a sort of more concentrated power could account for the expenses. We could draw them from these various places. We've seen how the French monarchy wins, not just against the English, but against the same nobility that tendentially wanted to maintain some kind of provincial autonomy, and in fact had partially sabotaged the entire system. I mean, look at the Burgundians or the Bretons, all right? Except these lose at the end of the day, and they were also kind of concentrated their own power within their own territories, which paradoxically was also, exploited by the French monarchy that had always nominally ruled over that. As we said, this was sort of the normal scenario. Waging war involved entering enemy lands with enough troops to fend off potential attacks, and as an initial step, laying siege and capturing a city or several rural castles. This would then be fortified with garrisons and used as bases to overwinter if operations stretch beyond the autumn months, which highlights naturally how stone fortifications had become central to territorial control by this point, right? And of course, military engineering was advancing further. The Trace Italienne is born in the 15th century. That will spread before the Vauban system, basically all over the West, for entire era. Thus, so there was never like a static point in this, but as I explained in many videos, not just about medieval siege warfare, but also the modern one. Fundamentally, in fact, also in the latter era, there wasn't this actual capacity to surpass siege warfare that easily. I mean, still in the age of Marlborough, even commanders of his caliber would fight tens of sieges and a few battles comparatively. So, again, when does the Middle Ages end, and what is about, again, the alleged military revolution is actually revolutionary, right? It's mostly what happens in the second half of the 17th century, and even not, as we've seen in this case itself, that matters in terms at that point of the escalation, probably modern national armies and hundreds of thousands of men, but still, again, blocked by fortifications. This is quite a big deal. Defenders, for their part, rarely gambled on open battles. not much as people think, because, oh my God, they were scared of being defeated. This is another deep strategic misconception at the root. In fact, basically the ignorance for the art of war. First of all, with a few men, you could really hold out for a long time if castles were properly supplied, properly guarded, and so on. There were quite advanced and sophisticated assault tactics that at some point I will also probably also publish on, and we'll talk surely more about this. I made last winter a video about medieval siege warfare, explaining how traumatically advanced and fiercely brutal it practically was. But in that sense, there was we should fall back on the difference between the offensive and the defensive. The first one being the weak form of war, but with a positive aim, and the latter, the strong form of war, but with negative aim. And actually, the offensive is preferable, even though it costs more. So at that point, it's not much a matter of what you see in terms of military parity, but again, in terms of motivation and political will. It's what we were saying before regarding also wanting to get it over with, mostly from the offensive side, while, again, with a handful of guys, you can hold out for an important amount of time and attrition and lots of enemy resources. Everything, again, was much less... to us, it seems, oh my God, so they had castles and it was difficult to storm. So, oh my God, it's a problem. How did they do it? They didn't pose themselves this problem. I mean, they knew how it was, and it was just a strategic balance to calculate and going for it or not, right? Depending on what you wanted to achieve and for which purpose. Everything was incredibly smooth, homogeneous, standard in terms of tactics, etc. Of course, there are ways and ways of making war. Every clash is different, so you can find the worse. But at the end of the day, there is only basically one way of waging war in this fashion. And if actually your goal is to, I don't know, the bigger the enemy, the offensive army, let's say, is, in entering your own territory and storming things, the more you're actually prompted to meet this guy in open field. All right? It is true that also in later battles, like at the time of, the War of Spanish Succession, we mentioned Marlborough, Louis XIV, like, you do have, of course, okay, let's not risk the bigger battle unless it's necessary. But this happens mostly when fortifications can do most of the job, right? Fortifications that require garrisons, that is still a broader defeat to lose to begin with, and so they're not simply, okay, we have the magic card to play, let's simply defend and let's not going to attack. It really depends on what's between you and that case, I don't know, your capital, right, or stuff like that. But if you look at how often actual pitched battles were fought in the Middle Ages, and also how many smaller open field engagements existed that didn't make it on the history books simply out of a whim of the whoever is writing that story, not because they don't know that they were there, but because, I don't know, how do you collect the most important battle of the Middle Ages, right? If you go look at the war game series, that every person makes a choice, right? Some people don't even know that, I don't know, some important battles were fought in different parts of Europe. Some people literally do not know, most people literally do not know that. There were lots of open field engagements on a regular basis, naturally on a smaller scale, but still, like, smaller scale, how do you account for that? 2,000 men versus 3,000, how small scale is that compared to contexts like Azincourt, where, I don't know, historians think that, I don't know, more than 20,000 men is really a stretch per side. And even if it were, I don't know, just 500 versus 800, they happened, and altogether, if you make the math, they accounted for just big part of the clashes, and they were in open field. And true, basically, these are numbers for entire battle lines of minutes. I'm like, how don't you count them? How don't you care about them? Why do you have to stereotypically present everything as siege warfare and or something that, even siege warfare as a non-dynamic form of warfare? That's the greatest mistake, right? So in the 100 Years' War, we find many examples of this. For example, Crécy, Azincourt, we just mentioned, 1346, 1415. That is definitely the proof of course, a catastrophic loss, but it doesn't make school just per se. Again, lots of battles fought also by defenders winning. In any case, in the French siege, let's say, we have explained how this derived from the broader shattering of the French army, the fact that it had been very difficult to update and uniform after the monstrous expansion in the 13th century. So the English exploited this. They had, in the moment, great leaders, good soldiers. They made the right choices, but again, also a battle like Poitiers was equally, and it's of the same bunch, of the same also strategical dynamic. Shows you that these were closely fought battles, that there wasn't nothing altogether. They do look like, of course, they're not random outcomes, that the English had something that the French didn't have. But at large, if you really study and realize how, of course, they were balanced, there is nothing so structurally predetermined about the outcome of this, right? And actually, again, the French had pretty good armies at the end of the day. It's not like they needed to be suckers in order to lose, right? And again, I made last spring a series about the English armies of the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, if anything, explain a bit better how things practically work. Naturally, a cautious commander would reinforce their strongholds and wait for the enemy's campaign to collapse due to shortage of supplies, money, or simply the end of the favorable season. But this is wishful thinking, especially if you're overly cautious and you think that the enemy has attacked you without not knowing that he's going to pay for those losses. Again, it's the one-sided kind of abstraction that you find still in published books by people who are supposed to be expert about this. The enemy is going for it, perfectly knowing that you will contrast him. Like, there isn't a singular case in warfare that I've ever studied where somebody does something, unless there was a pretty much, like a failed state, something going on. The enemy had already been attacked by another army. Like, there was not a reaction, all right? And so, therefore, that wasn't a lack of balance that sort of justified or that kind of disorder and general problem. So, all in all, we're really looking at a picture of general logic, where most of these garrisons would mostly wait for a relief force to be saved from an onslaught that eventually had the means to create problems and to storm those places. That's why you would have pitched battles that, again, are not rare at all. Right? If you make a basic, this is a historiographical issue. We were talking about it also the other day for ancient battles from the historians of the classical world. We have a much smaller list per era, per years of major battles, clashes for antiquity than we have for the Middle Ages. Right? So why? Because for the Middle Ages, we're also better documented, so every single clash of the 100 Years' War, say, makes it into a British publication about the major battles of the Middle Ages, equally for the Wars of the Roses, whatever. But in practice, it's also because we know, in fact, there is a choice, right? And so, in proportion, if we take away these factors that are obviously causing the thing, but let's say, aren't the Middle Ages provided with much more, pitched battles than antiquity? But in perspective, again, you have big channels or some other idiot that says basically, no, pitched battles were rare. Rare in my eyes, right? And you can't simply see it for the type of armies that they used, and the fact that there isn't a strategical impediment or technical obstacle that basically invalidates, the possibility of fighting on a regular basis in open field. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so defensive attrition, leveraging fortified position to outlast invaders, is actually one of the most deleterious things you can do, in as much as you're basically giving the initiative to the enemy. Right, and again, if the enemy, even if the defensive is so effective in the Middle Ages. If the enemy has gone for it, it's not because he's an idiot that's going to be defensively attrition for no reason whatsoever. All right, and also the defense, let's say, of castles or fortifications is not such a difficult thing. An impossible thing to surpass for the offender, right? Normally, again, even just from a political point of view, because people think just the technology of it. But when a massive army arrives, you just even don't want to be in the way, and you will maybe surrender. You will flee. It's that easy, and it happens all the time. And they had the means, they had the artillery, they had the technicians. It was all there. It's medieval warfare under everybody's eyes, except, again, it depends on how you tell medieval warfare and what kind of sources you use and how you use them, and that's always the same story, right? I try to be as objective as possible, and this is my purpose as Schwerpunkt in a broader sense. It's more the political engine to be more limited in scale and sort of power than warfare having any particular, say, limit to it, right? Big battles, big clashes with 30,000 men at some point are, as we see, have been fought in the 13th, 14th century, moments in which the systems were also relatively more fragmented. So it really depends on, or at least it really depends, but tendentially so. In fact, one feature of late medieval warfare is some kind of broader territorialization of power. The fact that with big financial cracks of the previous generations, people will invest more in land, the same politics do so. There is, again, this sense of alienation, of exhaustion, of fear, the commoners, etc., that confer more power to more autocratic figures, monarchs, princes. The nobility simply takes over what it has to do, and it's also brutal, it's also military in many ways. If anything, what this period shows in that sort of a refinement we're talking about before towards a more Renaissance type of clash, it's some kind of broader organization, in the sense that nothing is immediately improvised, at least, yes, as we've seen, some forces on a smaller scale are easy to be levied in technical terms, especially the smaller they are, but at the same time doesn't mean that in relative terms the political effect was too sustainable in that regard. So the bigger the system, the bigger, in theory, there could be at least an effectiveness in maybe contained forces, but still sort of tendentially more structured, uniformed, disciplined, paid. That's at least the goal, right? And this is where especially monarchies are heading towards. In areas the invader aimed to annex, attempts might be made to forge pacts with local nobles and communities to secure their loyalty or to bribe garrison leaders to defect. This was, again, often happening pretty much everywhere, right? Shifting allegiances were a hallmark of political survival. Again, this had always been the case. It just changes in the degree of this era. However, when resistance was met, the standard response was also mercilessness, intended to set a precedent and crush the populace's resolve at a point. A city that hesitated too long to surrender was often left to be sacked. This was completely normal from a long time. Think about, sack of Jerusalem. God will recognize his own in the massacre of Béziers, if I'm not wrong. People act as if this, oh my God, this is terrible, but it's actually completely normal. If, as we said before, the decisive moral majority of a community still holds in arms against you and is killing you as well, like you are responsible for it, regardless of whichever motivation that very often was, in fact, like in traditional terms, like if you believe in the same truth, which was much more strongly believed in the past, what's the point of view of breaking the system apart, right? And so, as we've seen also for the Cathars, they actually deserved that, and many other heretical groups were absolutely in line with the papacy as far as that was concerned, including the Valdensians, because those were just pure fanatics. Instead, the hypercritical, puritanistic, anti-papistic rhetoric of later times said that basically every heretic in medieval times was a hero of free thinking, of modernity and whatever. just out of your blipping mind. In any case, it made a lot of sense, and these laws had sort of always been there. What you start seeing in the later Middle Ages is some sort of more, if you want, even more rationalized massacre, right? There are episodes. The brutal sack of Limoges in 1370, recounted by Jean Froissart, that I made a video on. There, the Black Prince's forces massacred resistors to deter further defiance. I mean, in that case, it was sort of, contingentally explainable. The devastation was even more severe in wars of attrition, of course, because more damage was inflicted in interest of time. Like, if you want to destroy a local agricultural economy, one raid is already enough. If you repeat that, if you really squeeze everything out of the people, just even to forage, to sustain your own forces, it's going to be really messed up. And as we've seen, the free companies tend to be a bit without control. But being part of a broader, bigger dynamic, say like the piece of Bretigny that had left all these groups mostly without a job. And so there is an unprecedented scale in the kind of, in that sense, liberty of violence that these companies can take. Also because, again, a broader power that was previously functional had collapsed, also in part through war, right? So the invaders could enter the enemy territory, not to hold it permanently, which was also very difficult and expensive to do, because garrisons were very expensive. You had to pay them to stay there, otherwise they would go away. Because, again, a garrison is also sitting there normally, at least in a military context, to await for the enemy to target that settlement in a way or another. And so again, if there is no relief force to be expected, like in this case across the channel, it's going to be a bit complicated even to maintain them, and who's paying for that anyway? There were also many autonomous nobiliary initiatives as far as this chevauchée were concerned. And again, you go fight in France and then you come back to England, and who cares about France, right? In every term. That's also what in part alienated the same supporters of the English, the House of England cause, even in places that had historically supported that, to escape the centralizing policy of France, that instead, at the end of the day, says, okay, you know what, we're tired of the English way, we'll pass to France, and at least things will be better, right? This is a mentality that strongly resonates with late medieval communities that accept also more autocratic forms of government because they are exhausted by the war. They don't want to pay for that anymore. They don't want to go for military expedition. They want to risk their lives. They prefer to pay to get their liberty limited in the process, but not to go to losing something bigger. And this, again, is because how do you control a population, again, if it is against you? It's not like a medieval city is something that you can't simply control through a mean of imposition. As we said before, this is really impossible. There aren't the powers that you must broker deal with them. And so everything evolves through a civilized pattern, after all, that does witness the development of civilization. The chevauchée could be that relentlessly destructive. Vineyards and orchards were razed, livestock was seized, villages were torched, and peasants unable to pay ransoms were slaughtered or maimed. John Oakwood, at some point in Italy, found, apparently this is one of the many myths about him, found two men-at-arms of his white company that wanted to rape a nun. They both wanted to rape her in the moment, and he sort of made a pretty Solomonic choice. He picked up his sword and cut the poor woman in half, so at least she was spared from, further pain. But this is just for saying how brutal the entire situation really was. There is really a lot about this devastation that takes on a strategic calculus, right? It's not merely brutality. It takes a heart of stone to do that, but that's exactly what these men are trained for, and that had always been the case, especially for the professional soldiery and the men-at-arms that led them in particular. We made lots of videos about the brutal psychophysical training of the European elite. And this brutal and ruinous aspect of warfare, so a very intense war directed against civilians by armies that included, at least in part, as we've seen, men that were also from other countries, by the way, so did not give a damn about these people. And they could simply go home at some point and not to think too much about it. And we're talking also people from lower social status, from fringe areas. I mean, the Catalans, right? The Brabants, they had different. The first were mountaineers from the fringe of Iberia. The Brabants were heretical Fort Essayiers, also preparing a bit about them. From quite autonomous and sort of libertine in this place, in fact, of Flanders, like the same name suggests, Brabant et Similia, that's a synecdoche. And so we're talking about people were specializing in that. I made a video about the Bidot, which were this kind of scorchers, like at least javeliners, lighter infantry of kind that you find very much in this Anglo-Gascon chevauchée. The Gascons historically had been, back in the day, mostly about sort of skirmishing. At least they had a greater proportion of that being closer to Iberia at Similia. And so you understand also how dramatic the 14th and 15th century in Europe actually were. Just like pretty much everywhere, this was a collapse also in Asia of the Pax Mongolica, fragmentation of power. Again, the plague had exhausted everyone and everything, given that also all these wars had been raging since ever, and so the systems had been exhausted. The same plague is likely the consequence of a prior exhaustion rather than some random bacillum arriving from some Central Asian parasite. Nevertheless, we know that this period is also magic for Europe in terms of, think about humanism, art, technology, this remarkable flourishing of many techniques, etc. This is actually a product of the crisis, right? This is something you find also in other periods. And for example, in the late Roman army, realized that the Byzantines sort of come up with sort of ingenious technical solutions. Whether they were actually applied or not, that's another matter. But say they would have not come around hadn't there been a greater sort of need to seek for the best rather than the good enough, right? Trying to, at least ideally, find out solutions to concrete problems. There is a bit of disparity there. Here in late medieval Europe and largely in the Latin Germanic world, you have a much more concrete, in fact, also bloody mentality that is able to express the most beautiful art. That's also chopping people to pieces in this terrible wars. This had always happened pretty much everywhere, but here you appreciate the genius, the good side, the civilization behind that. And that's where you understand better the relation between politics and warfare. There is a study made by Guy Bois that speaks of the 100 Years' Wars and titles a chapter Hiroshima in Normandy. So basically he meant that English campaigns in this region, that again was one of those that had initially also created the Norman, in fact, dynasty of England. So we call them Angevins, they all descended from the Normans also. The Angevins, it's proper in the male line, but still eventually bailed out of the Philo-English attitude because of the crudelity and the bloodthirstiness of the English and their soldiery. And that, again, was also pretty much in line with the times, but at some point became too heavy to bear, especially just having this axis with Rouen just across the channel. And so at some point this region that will be always theater of raids of some sort, however, sticks to France, basically. So atomic bombing can be compared in terms of losses to, in fact, much worse. In fact, the reason why the Americans used that in World War II is that it prevented, actually, it brought Japan to end the war much sooner. Much more people would have actually died. So how this tilted in political terms in Normandy, let's say, during the 100 Years' War is actually in favor of France, because France had eventually the civilizational upper hand, but it helped catalyzing that process, so to say. Because it's that moment of crisis that spurs people. It's not like these massacres, this destructive raids unleashed like in these regions going on for months. We're saying, okay, well, this happened, it's just like another thing. No, this is a big deal. Politically, communitally, morally, like it can't happen again. Like it can't destroy everything. It can't be, of course, it's not like everything could be destroyed, but it's like, again, compared to mass society of 20th century US and Japan, like, isn't it similar to Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombings? It can be, absolutely. By the way, we know that at least in terms of person that would routinely be involved in some kind of clash, say French population in the 14th century was much more militarized than, I don't know, the Prussia of Frederick the Great, right? And that shows you how needed that was. Again, politics is more unstable, the state is not consolidated, but so you would find yourself into some kind of weird situation at some point. This is particular the 14th century for France because of the war and everything, but it was also common to many other areas of Europe, right? We've seen that the 1355-56 chevauchée led by Edward the Black Prince ended up in fact, the culminating battle of Poitiers was actually one of those brutal chevauchées. And at that point, the English were actually retreating because the whole French royal army was on their tails. And they're actually cornered, and that's how they scored the victory. But also from their side, we're actually not the strongest force in the moment in which, for example, the French could simply mobilize in a strategic sense. And you realize that expeditions like this would leave Gascony, at least the parts that were held by the French and Languedoc, economically crippled. Right? And let's consider this, that many of these people did not even actually side with France, or did not sympathize. It's not like the Occitanians were much, but again, it was like a free-for-all. At that point, if northern French authority collapsed, you could simply take advantage of it in raiding and pillaging just as a form of, okay, let's do something about it. Let's cripple for the confidence towards France that can't defend these guys. And at the same time, let's gain something by looting and raiding. And this is brutal because it's also a war between Occitanians, given that the Gascons are supporting the English in that. It tells you how messed up the whole thing really is. And also how, even though, again, of course, British historiography emphasized the effectiveness of the chevauchée, it's also like the lower end of this, right? The fact that at the end of the day, France survived and managed to maintain control in the bulk of the country, in spite of the fact that, again, the Burgundians were still basically French, however, at that point, in practice, part of the same monarchy system, and the English marched in Paris. Well, still, again, skirting around the bigger center of power, it's not indicative really of, okay, now we will simply strike at the heart of the enemy. Like, also Crécy, also Azincourt were, if you want, accidental battles of some sort. Like, again, the English were simply raided and come back home to gain something gradually, but not going straight at Paris. Right? Eventually would seize that because they had defeated the English, the French in open field, but in such big ways that at some point they were also trying to escape, and they thought it would have been quite desperate, and they were sort of, they fought because they were strategically cornered by a superior force that had obliged them to fight. So you understand also how the narrative in strategic perspective is crucial to understand how things and stories go. And people live through this. Like how many, if you come from Britain and from England, especially, you will have ancestors that did this at some point. And so just think how your culture was informed by the memory of this, by the broader political, cultural connections, right, of history. It's very, very, very important. And so, also, political concentration as a response from the crisis. This is a very important dynamic because, as we've seen, some of the most advanced systems came back pretty fast on their feet. All right, the French will have troubles for a long time. Let's say, I don't know, other powers that are normally described as ravaged by the free companies, like the Italian lordships. Actually, by the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century, just a few decades after those raids, which is enough, admittedly, but still, it was something that they created themselves to throw against each other. They began to hire only Italians. It was the face of the foreigners, including the ones that they had been able to absolutely discipline, especially in the first half of the 14th century. The Germans were quite sort of straightforwardly used by the Italians as heavy cavalry, so the French in part. The Germans, again, were there also at the Battle of Poitiers in the same French army, etc. And so you realize that this happens not just as a sort of bouncing. There is the crisis, systems cope with this, but they also arrive in that sense at a more advanced stage in statal development that other parts of Europe do not quite have in the same way. The centralized fiscal system, in a sense, can be criticized, as people will do in general, like as a phenomenon exacerbating all the resources draining of the system. This is true, and as we explained before, also the 13th, 14th century eventually collapses, or at least shrank dramatically as a system because probably over exhaustion, all right? But at the same time, the medieval civilization doesn't stop there. Like antiquity, actually, what you see here with the Renaissance is just its own continuity and its own sort of stepping up. There is no major fracture. There is a major fracture, but it's not. It's more an exhaustion, like the structures of an exhaustion of the substance. The structures actually consolidate. They shrink a little bit, but they also become more qualitative, as we've seen in terms of centralized control, because they are structured to cope better with the crises that have just withstood. It's a bit like what happened in the late Roman Empire when the system became more bureaucratic, so to say. There was a specific reason. There had been a major crisis and the system needed to react by a greater control. And this system, again, continues as the Ancien Regime for like such a long time in ways that, again, we usually don't parallel because, again, the Roman Empire kind of ended. And said the Renaissance is, again, the military revolution, whatever they want to make you believe. But there is merit in this continuation of late medieval civilization, also through, in fact, the creation of a more bureaucratic state, more taxes, if anything, collected more effectively, more uniformly, in a way that makes more sense. It also develops broader reasoning on representation and the cooptation of estates. So it's important. It's also an institutional and cultural level. Besides, other factor that at least did not prevent campaigns from being prolonged and, in this sense, annoying, the cyclical representation of the same Black Death, like plague epidemics, continued up until the 18th century to infest the old world and other places all around the globe, telling the truth. It definitely represents at least one of the bleakest facets of this era, a period when the cumulative impact of war and disease reshaped European society, undermining, again, in this sort of indirect way, in the older, at least feudal system, that this was already over from a while, made multiple videos explaining how this was the case. And paving the way, again, for this early modern state formation that is so overly celebrated, there was actually just already a product and present in the, in at least, again, when is the state born, really, right? You can't just say, okay, well, it did not exist during the Middle Ages. All right, it had existed, it was effective, and it just improved, it adapted, it became more courageous. And it's mostly depending on the people's attitude and force, right? It's always, at the end of the day, the same kind of dynamic and mechanism. But just for saying how, even in art, etc., you can see how some of the most beautiful works, ingenuity is stimulated by these terrible times. Like it's also not really given necessarily a more comprehensive answer than before, but it's reacting to that in ways that tell you how profound the impact had been, how difficult this whole enterprise had been, how the system was shattered, right, by something so funereal like the plague, and how terrible, even in the life of it all, this had been, what kind of trace it had left. It's so dramatic in its implications. It's so really self-evident, even in the way war is represented, even in the way like certain emphasis on torture and violence and brutality is sort of dramatized, for example, in late medieval art. I don't know if you noticed that, but in general, right, it's an actual thing. It depends naturally in part by who are those who actually, let's say, control that narrative, which is not like, again, like that can't be single thought in any time in history, not even today, as people like to believe. But in the sense that, again, this is an elite system that takes over, and it does so by also representing a certain view of the world that has been shattered. It's not like the, let's say, the feudal system had not emanated something more powerful and sort of in symbolic in terms of its own prestige and traditional and imperial ethos and so on. But excuse me, I'm writing something for the images, but this whole, and what I was saying is that the imagery looks more, at sometimes more realistic, and so less, let's say, archetypal. It sort of suggests some reflection on the nature of life. There is this inherent tension, even in humanism, regarding like what humanity can attain. If in the debate of whether it can attain it anymore, this had been the great issue at the end of antiquity. Now, at the end of the Middle Ages, that, as we've seen, is not really the end of the Middle Ages, but something developing further. It opens to different paths. It opens to different interpretation, to alchemy, to even a necessity to recover at this point with the philological means of the times, for example. The classical understanding of reality. How do you cope in front of disaster, tragedy? And this is really an important topic to touch upon. And so that's mostly what we're looking at and what we are in turn sensitive to when we look at this era that is very, very interesting. Again, I'm glad, as I said at the beginning of the video, to have made enough stuff because like up to a few years ago I said, oh my god, so few stuff about the 15th century. It is still few. It's here I see not even 100 videos, but still now we have, especially in the last year or so, made almost 30 videos about the 15th century. And it starts becoming really something, right? And it may, I don't know, it's not like this arrives from the same cycle as before. So if this stuff did not appear before, it's not really because it came out of a different mechanism. But again, that's the same we can do for other eras, and we will lustricate, so to say, this every, in this case, the 15th century was any other period with ever more information of this kind, with ever more reflection of the time. And remember that some of these videos are just like, for example, today's one really was born out of the necessity of conceptualizing strategy, if anything, in some relatively explicatory fashion, in the concrete practice of the warfare of the year. So it's not like it is something so in depth, but also as a general topic, it's worth, in my opinion, looking at, because it's naturally incorporating so many aspects about the rest of the videos that we're going to do in relatively more in-depth fashion. By the way, with autumn, there is something sort of more, I don't know, we will look at more stories, there's the Halloween period. We usually make something either about Transylvania or about, I don't know, some more sort of traditionally obscure aspects, etc. So again, I have a lot in store. We can expand really in different directions at some point. Now I've really made it in terms of concrete, let's say, video preparation, like with kind of greater variety. We can modulate this all, right? It was just seeing here the video I made about Vlad Cepes, which sort of seemed quite appropriate in that sort of more dark direction that, however, is part of the mythology of the 15th century in this case. And so, as I understand, it fits well that period, that era. It's part of also the drama. For example, the Ottoman invasions of more, and also in fact of a war that is transforming in much more brutal fashion elsewhere. Think about how much we complain about the plague, but how much we sort of don't complain about the Ottoman invasions in a broader sense, and how this affected places that are so close to us. It's always interesting, by the way, to make this kind of content. Again, I would like to make more for everything, because it feels like still after 2,500 videos, we haven't sort of glued everything together in the right way. But hey, we are trying, and by this rhythm, at least, I hope that we're gonna get somewhere quickly, more easily, and we're not going to be, let's say, this is not going to be a problem for long, if it is at some point. Again, I see here a reasonable amount of video choices, right, of specific stuff that was absolutely fine in terms of types of videos that we needed to really discuss, from little to big things, different countries, different eras. Let me check what I have in store for the 15th century, if I have, because I have over 70 videos in store. Actually, not videos, as I often say, videos, but they have something about late medieval warfare, yes. Something there is, but the 15th century in particular, yeah, something about artillery once again. We made a lot of artillery. We're probably going to exhaust that topic at a point. We're going to talk about more about troops, all their variety. That was one case, also relatively repetitive, at least from your perspective, because I know exactly from what does that come from. And no, it doesn't seem like we have, for now, something about the 15th century. Or, yeah, kind of something, yeah, there is something, not it's going to take a long time. This is even more tied to today's video because it's sort of like the germs of change, like in the 15th century. So this video is great to have made this video because it's sort of prelude to this more like how did warfare properly change towards the pike and then later pike and shot system. So yeah, that's actually very positive. It's actually very good. I'm glad that we're preparing this stuff very well. Have also lots of specials. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.